Hey friends, tonight, let's not chat about the legends of kings and generals, nor the flowery romances of knights and princesses. Let's talk about something a bit more down to earth, those medieval peasants' equations for food in the soil. What exactly were they busy with all day long? You might think that clocking in and out of work, toiling away on projects day and night, already makes you quite the corporate slave. But believe me, if you could travel back to medieval Europe and experience a peasant's daily life, you'd probably feel that being a modern, corporate slave might even come with its own small, certain happiness. Of course, this is just a little reflection of ours. History, you see, is like that, full of hardships unimaginable to us modern folk, yet it also possesses a unique rhythm palavras to that era. So, if you're also interested in this piece of history, feel free to give a like and subscribe to our channel. You're also welcome to quietly tell me in the comments what city you're in and what time it is as you listen to this narration. If you'd like, you can dim the lights a little more, or play some soft background sounds you enjoy, like the rain outside your window, or a soothing piece of instrumental music. Alright, let's slowly unwind and step into the long day of a medieval peasant together. That was an era distant from our own, roughly between the 5th and 15th centuries. Europe back then didn't have the skyscrapers we're accustomed to, nor the endless streams of cars. Looking out, the land was mostly covered by vast, uncultivated forests, swamps, and dotted among them, small villages. These villages were where the vast majority of the medieval population, the peasants, lived and toiled for generations. Imagine such a village. Houses were typically built of wood, mud, and thatch, low and huddled together, their roofs perhaps sporting moss or a few tufts of wild grass. In the center of the village, there might be a small common green, a well, and perhaps an old tree beside it, a silent witness to centuries of the village's joys and sorrows. Not far away stood a stone church, its spire the tallest structure in the entire village. Its bell would chime melodiously at specific times, regulating people's routines and reminding them of the presence of faith. And behind the village and the church, or rather, in a more central position, often lay the Lord's manor. This manor could be a modest stone and timber house, or a heavily fortified castle, varying in size, but it was undoubtedly the center of power in this land. Because medieval Europe was dominated by a social system known as feudalism or the manorial system. Simply put, the king granted large tracts of land to nobles and the church, who became lords. And most of the peasants living on these lands were not free. They were called serfs. The word serf itself sounds a bit heavy. They weren't like slaves in ancient Rome, who could be bought, sold, and killed at will, but they were bound to the lord and the land. They couldn't freely leave the village of their birth. Generation after generation, they had to cultivate the lord's land, pay various taxes, and obey the lord's governance and laws. The lord offered them some protection from outside raiders, but this protection came at a steep price. Peasants had to work unpaid on the lord's domain, the land directly controlled by the lord, for several days a week. This was called corvée labor, or boon work. A portion of the grain they harvested and the poultry they raised had to be surrendered to the lord. Even using the lord's mill to grind flour, his oven to bake bread, or gathering firewood in his forests required payment, either in cash or in kind. Even for marriages and funerals, serfs often needed the lord's permission and had to pay a marriage tax, or inheritance tax. This life was like an invisible net, tightly enveloping every serf. From birth, their fate seemed sealed. There weren't many choices, and it was very difficult to move up the social ladder. Day after day, year after year, they faced the land, the crops, the lord's various regulations, and the unpredictable weather. Alright, now, please gently close your eyes and imagine you are an ordinary peasant in an ordinary village in medieval Europe. The sky hasn't brightened yet. It's probably around 3 or 4 in the morning. Outside, it's pitch black. You can't see your hand in front of your face, with only a few distant stars twinkling faintly in the remote sky. You're curled up on a crude bed, which might just be a pile of straw emociones on the ground, covered with a coarse linen cloth or an animal hide. The chill, especially in autumn and winter, would unceremoniously seep in through the gaps in the thatched roof and from the earthen floor, making you instinctively shrink. There's no alarm clock. What rouses you from your sleep is most likely the first cock's crow in the village. The rooster's call, sharp and long, is like a daily assembly call blown punctually at dawn, announcing the start of a new day's labor. You groggily open your eyes, taking a while to adjust before you can vaguely make out the outlines of things in the dim room. The air is filled with a complex smell, the earthy scent of soil, the odor of livestock, and perhaps the lingering smoky smell from the hearth fire that hasn't quite dissipated. Because often, for warmth and to save space, your whole family, along with a few chickens, maybe even a piglet, would be squeezed into this same small, thatched hut. You slowly sit up, your bones creaking slightly as if rusted. The fatigue from yesterday's long day of work doesn't seem to have fully left your body. But you have no time to complain, nor the right to stay in bed. You fumble for your clothes, a short tunic made of coarse linen, perhaps trousers of the same material, stiff and a bit itchy against your skin. Summer is bearable. In winter, you might have an old sheepskin or a heavy linen overcoat. Shoes, if you could call them that, would likely be simple wooden-soled shoes, or you might simply be barefoot. As you rustle about, your wife, or your parents and children, also gradually wake up. The hut is cramped, offering almost no privacy. Everyone simply splashes some cold water on their faces, and that's considered washing up. Teeth? Oh, there was no toothpaste or toothbrush in that era. At most, you might use a small twig or your finger to rub them, or rinse your mouth with salt water. That would be considered quite meticulous. Next is breakfast. Don't expect any milk and cereal or bacon and eggs. For a medieval peasant, breakfast was usually very simple, even meager. A piece of dark bread, coarse in texture, hard as a rock, requiring effort to chew. Sometimes it might be accompanied by a little homemade small beer or water. On better days, your wife might cook a small pot of oatmeal porridge or bean soup, bubbling high and offering a bit of warmth to your empty stomach. But more often, to save fuel and time, breakfast was eaten cold. You eat in silence, with little conversation, because everyone knows that another long and arduous day lies ahead. After this simple meal, you begin to prepare for the fields. Men were usually the main laborers, responsible for most of the heavy work in the fields. You first check your farming tools. That might be a heavy wooden plow, its tip perhaps reinforced with a little iron, a clumsy hoe, or a long-handled sickle. Many of these tools were made and repaired by yourselves, crude but functional. You carefully check if the plowshare is loose or the hoe handle is firm, because these will be your most important companions for the rest of the day. If your family owns an ox or a horse, which would be considered relatively wealthy for an ordinary serf, as most might only have a donkey or two, or even rely solely on human power, then you also have to feed the livestock. You add some hay or beans for them and check if the harness is in good condition. These animals are important laborers and part of the family's assets. They cannot be neglected. Meanwhile, your wife is likely not idle either. She might be looking after young children, assigning them some tasks within their capabilities, like gathering firewood or fetching water from the village well. She also has to prepare the midday meal to be brought to the fields, perhaps some bread, cheese, if lucky, or a small pot of thin porridge. Poultry, like chickens and geese, also need to be fed and tended to. Their eggs are a rare source of protein and might also be used to pay off some taxes in kind. And so, just as the sky begins to lighten, with a hint of dawn in the eastern sky, you, a medieval peasant, have completed this series of preparations from waking up to heading out. No coffee to perk you up, no news to browse, not even a self-motivating, "Let's do our best today." You just habitually, or rather, fatedly, shoulder your tools, push open the creaking wooden door, and merge into the stream of other early risers from the village, heading by step, heavily, towards the Lord's fields or your small strip of land. The distant church bell might be chiming at this very moment, reminding you that the new day has unequivocally begun. Your figure, in the early morning mist, appears small and indistinct, yet imbued with an unspeakable resilience. You follow the other villagers, your feet sinking into the muddy ridges between fields. The morning mist, like a thin veil, has not yet completely dispersed, and the air carries the dampness of dew and the faint grassy scent. After walking for about the time it takes to eat a meal, you arrive at the Lord's vast domain. Compared to your own few narrow strips of land, this place seems boundless. The soil here also looks more fertile. After all, the Lord always had the priority to choose the best land and had more manpower and resources to care for it. The steward, or reeve, he was usually a serf himself, promoted by the Lord for his shrewdness and capability, responsible for overseeing everyone's work, is already waiting there. He holds a wooden staff symbolizing his authority, his expression stern, his sharp gaze sweeping over everyone who arrives. He doesn't need to shout reprimands, just that cold stare is enough to make anyone be late or slack off. After all, neglecting the Lord's farm work could result in a whipping at best, or at worst, losing the already meager plot of land one possessed. Today's task, if it's spring, is most likely plowing. Spring plowing is a crucial part of the year's agricultural cycle. The land has slumbered all winter, and now needs to be awakened, softened, so that the seeds of hope can be sown. You walk to your assigned area, where several groups have already started working. The air carries the mooing of oxen, the shouts of men, and the dull scraping sound of plowshares cutting through the soil. Now it's your turn. You and your partner, perhaps your neighbor, or a relative, lead over the scrawny but still relatively strong old ox. This ox might be provided by the Lord, or it might be jointly owned by several families. You expertly harness it, connecting it to the somewhat cumbersome wooden plow. In the early Middle Ages, many places still used a simple plow called an ard, or scratch plow, which could only cut a shallow furrow in the soil and couldn't truly turn over the clods. However, by the mid-Middle Ages, some regions began using heavier wheeled plows, which had a moldboard that could completely turn over the sod, providing better deep plowing, but requiring more animal power, such as 4 or even 8 oxen to pull. The one you're using now might be something in between, or, if your manner is relatively backward, it's still that same ard that has been used for who knows how many years. You grip the plow handles tightly, while your partner in front leads the ox or prods it forward with a long goad. "Giddy up! Giddy up!" The shouts echo across the fields. The ox takes heavy steps, the plowshare digging deep into the soil. You need to use all your strength to control the depth and direction of the plow, ensuring the furrow is both deep and straight. The moist earth curls up, carrying a unique fragrance, but it's also exceptionally heavy. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, and you have to be very careful with every step, lest you be pulled over by the plowshare or stepped on by the ox. Sweat soon soaks the hair on your forehead, trickling down your cheeks, itchy, but you can't spare a hand to wipe it. Your arms ache from the continuous exertion, and your lower back begins to throb dully. But you cannot stop, nor can you complain. The Lord's land must be cultivated within the stipulated time. For about 2 or 3 days a week, sometimes more. You have to work like this for the Lord without pay. This is the so-called labor rent, one of the most important obligations of you serfs. On these days, the work on your own strips of land has to be temporarily set aside or left to the women and children in your family. Sometimes, thinking of your own land lying fallow while you sweat here for someone else, a touch of bitterness inevitably rises in your heart. But what can be done? This is the fate you were born into. Land that has been plowed once also needs to be harrowed to break up the large clods and make the soil more even. The harrow is also made of wood, like a giant comb. Pulling the harrow is relatively easier, but still tedious. You go back and forth, row after row, until the plot assigned to you is tilled to the steward's satisfaction. If it's summer, the main farm work in the fields becomes weeding and hoeing. In an age without herbicides, weeds grow astonishingly fast, competing with the crops for sunlight, water, and nutrients. You toil under the scorching sun, bent over, holding a short-handled hoe, or simply pulling weeds by hand. The roots of these weeds often run deep, and you need to exert considerable effort to pull them out completely. Prolonged bending makes your spine feel like it's about to break. Beads of sweat roll down your forehead, hitting the dry earth and disappearing instantly. The sun beats down mercilessly on your skin, making you feel parched, dizzy, and lightheaded. Occasionally, you straighten up, your aching back, and sneak a glance at the sun. It seems to hang there, motionless, and time passes incredibly slowly. The furrows seem endless, stretching to the horizon. Around you are other serfs, just like you, toiling away with their heads down. No one speaks. There are only the sounds of tools scraping against the earth and heavy breathing. Occasionally, the steward appears behind you like a ghost, scrutinizing your work with his hawk-like eyes. You quickly lower your head and work even harder, terrified of him finding any fault. These farming tools are mostly simple in structure, primarily made of wood, with some iron on the key parts, like plowshares, hoe blades, and sickles. Iron was a precious metal at the time. Lords might own all iron tools, but those used by serfs often exemplified the principle of using good steel only for the cutting edge. These tools had no ergonomic design to speak of, were very strenuous to use, and wore out quickly, requiring frequent repairs. Some tools might be provided by the lord, but more often, serfs had to find ways to acquire or make them themselves. A good sickle, during harvest season, could save you a lot of effort and allow you to finish your share of the work faster. Medieval agricultural technology was, on the whole, relatively backward. To maintain soil fertility, many places practiced a three-field system, or two-field system. For example, in the three-field system, arable land was divided into three parts: one sown in autumn with wheat or rye, one sown in spring with barley, oats, or beans, and the third left fallow for a year to recover fertility, also serving as pasture. This rotational farming could, to some extent, prevent excessive soil depletion. Your village's land is likely divided this way too. Every year, you have to cultivate different crops on different plots. Working on the Lord's domain brought no direct wages. You exchanged your sweat and toil merely for the right to continue living on this land and permission to cultivate your small strip of land in the remaining time. The produce from that strip, after deducting the various heavy taxes paid to the Lord and the Church, was the very basis for your family's survival. So, although working in the Lord's fields was exhausting and sometimes a source of resentment, everyone still tried their best. Because it concerned the relationship between the entire village and the Lord, and indirectly, their own survival. Sometimes, the Lord would also issue temporary, boon work, orders, such as during harvest season, requiring all serfs, including women and children obstaculos enough to work, to prioritize helping the Lord bring in his crops. or when castles, roads, or bridges were being built, serfs would be conscripted for labor. This additional work further burdened the peasants. You keep your head down, silently repeating the motion in your hands. Plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting throughout the year, the farm work seems endless. Spring planting and autumn harvesting, summer tilling and winter storage. Each season has its specific tasks and challenges. In spring, you worry about late frost destroying the newly sprouted seedlings. In summer, you pray for abundant rain but not floods. In autumn, you hope for a good harvest. And in winter, you must store enough food and firewood for the coming year. Your palms are covered with thick calluses, some places even cracked open, oozing blood that mixes with dirt, quickly turning purplish black. Dirt is lodged under your fingernails, impossible to wash clean. Your skin, weathered by years of sun and wind, has become coarse and dark, your face etched with wrinkles inappropriate for your age. You rarely have the chance to ponder the meaning of life or the distant future. All you can feel is the present fatigue of your body and the anticipation and anxiety for the next meal, the next season's harvest. Occasionally, in a moment of straightening up to catch your breath, you might see birds flying freely in the sky, unconstrained. You might secretly envy them for a moment, but that thought is fleeting. Because you know that this land beneath your feet, these furrows, are your entire life. The sun is still overhead, radiating scorching heat, urging you to lower your head and continue the seemingly endless labor. You take a deep breath and grip your tool once more. Finally, when the sun has climbed to its zenith and then tilted slightly westward, the distant church bell chimes faintly, or the steward's somewhat weary shout is heard, announcing the arrival of a short midday break. You straighten up with a sigh of relief, feeling as if your entire back is as stiff as a board. Sweat has soaked through your coarse linen tunic, clinging uncomfortably to your skin. You and the other serfs gather in twos and threes at the edge of the field, finding a sparse patch of shade, or simply sitting on the earthen ridges. Your wife, or perhaps an older child from your family, might already be waiting there with a basket or a clay pot. Inside is your lunch for the day. Don't expect any lavish dishes. It's usually just a piece of dark bread, slightly smaller than the one you had in the morning, perhaps accompanied by a small, hard piece of strong-smelling cheese, if your family happens to own a sheep or two, or a cow that gives milk. If you're lucky, the pot might contain some warm pottage, made from oats, beans, and some wild greens, thick as paste, but at least it can fill your stomach and replenish some energy. You take it, not bothering to wash your hands, and begin to gnaw on the bread with your dirt-caked fingers. The bread is dry and scratches your throat. You need to take sips of water from your leather water skin or the small beer your wife brought. This beer has a very low alcohol content, mostly brewed from barley, and tastes a bit sour, but for peasants lacking food and clothing, it's already a rare beverage, at least safer than drinking raw water. You eat in silence. Few people talk loudly or laugh. Partly because of exhaustion, partly because there's nothing much to be happy about. Occasionally someone might grumble about the heat or the heavy work, but their voices are low, as if talking to themselves. As you eat, you glance sideways at the others. Everyone's face bears the same fatigue and numbness, as if this endless toil has drained all their vitality. This was the most common midday meal for a medieval peasant. Their diet was very monotonous, primarily consisting of grains. Wheat bread was a luxury enjoyed by nobles and the wealthy. Ordinary peasants mostly ate bread baked or griddled from rye, barley, oats, and other coarse grains. It was dark in color, rough in texture, but very filling. Besides bread, various beans, such as peas, broad beans, and lentils, were also important food sources. They could be cooked into thick soups or made into a paste-like staple with grains, the pottage mentioned earlier. This pottage was a near constant feature on medieval European tables, with various available vegetables like onions, carrots, cabbages, turnips, and leeks added according to the season and family's means. Meat was a luxury for ordinary serfs. They rarely got to eat fresh meat. Only on holidays, or if the lord had leftovers from a hunt to distribute, might they taste a little. Usually, their main source of animal protein was some cured pork or salted fish. If the family raised chickens, eggs were also a precious source of nutrition. Milk and cheese were relatively more common, especially in pastoral areas. Peasants would also cultivate some vegetables and herbs in their small garden plots, or gather wild fruits, mushrooms, and nuts from the forest edges or riverbanks. However, forests were usually the lord's property, and unauthorized hunting or felling of trees was strictly forbidden. Poaching, if discovered, would be severely punished. The short midday break ends quickly. The steward's urging voice rings out again, and you have to put down your half-eaten bread, pick up your tools again, and return to that land you both love and hate. You love it because it grows food that keeps you and your family alive. You hate it because it drains all your strength yet never seems to satisfy your hungry stomach. The afternoon's farm work is no easier than the morning's. The sun is more brutal, the air hotter. You feel like a fish about to be dried out, every movement requiring immense effort. If today is a corvée labor day on the Lord's domain, you continue with the tasks assigned by the steward, either finishing what was left from the morning or moving to another field to start a new job. It might be pruning grapevines, which requires extra care and skill, or cleaning mud and weeds from irrigation ditches, a task with an unpleasant smell, or mowing grass in the Lord's meadow to store fodder for the livestock in winter. If it's not a corvée labor day, then in the afternoon you can work on your own strips of land. Though equally arduous, your mood might be slightly different. After all, you're working for yourself now. Every bit of effort holds the hope of a better harvest. Your few narrow strips of land might be scattered in different plots around the village, a characteristic of the open field system. You need to plan your planting meticulously on this limited land to feed your family, and pay the various rents and tithes to the Lord and the church. Near your hut, you might cultivate a small vegetable garden, planting a few rows of onions, turnips, or setting up a frame for beans to climb. Your wife and children would also spend considerable effort on this small garden. As dusk approaches, when the setting sun paints the clouds in brilliant orange-red hues, the village church bell chimes again, announcing the end of the day's fieldwork. Dragging your exhausted body, carrying heavy tools, you follow the other villagers slowly back to the village. The setting sun casts your shadows long and drawn out on the ridges and endure roadside grass. You barely have the strength to speak, just wanting to quickly return to that humble but at least sheltering home. Back at the hut, you can't immediately lie down and rest. Many miscellaneous chores await you. You need to put away your tools, check for damage, and see if they're usable for tomorrow. If your family keeps cattle, sheep, or pigs, you also have to feed them and clean their pens. The water jar might be nearly empty, and you or your older children need to fetch water from the village well. As winter approaches, you also need to store enough firewood, so you might have to gather some dry branches and fallen leaves from the nearby woods before it gets completely dark. And your wife, after returning from the fields, is even busier. She has to quickly start a fire and cook. A medieval peasant's home usually had only a simple hearth made of stone or clay, or sometimes just a shallow pit dug in the center of the room with an iron pot or clay jar set over it. There was no chimney for the thick smoke to escape, so it would drift out through gaps in the thatched roof and open doors and windows, leaving the hut constantly smoky. She has to wash vegetables, cut the leftover bread from a hornada, or cook a fresh pot of hot pottage. The children would be clamoring around her, perhaps fighting over a small piece of food. Besides cooking, women had many other household chores. they had to mend the family's clothes. Those coarse linen garments easily tore or wore out from daily labor. They also had to spin thread and weave cloth. Although cloth often had to be bought, some families would grow flax or raise sheep, then use simple spindles and looms to make some of their own fabric. Caring for children, especially young infants, consumed a great deal of their time and energy. Cleaning the hut, washing the few meager dishes, pickling vegetables for winter, making cheese and butter, if conditions allowed, these were all part of their daily routine. It could be said that medieval peasant women worked even longer hours than men, from before dawn until late at night. Your home, that small hut, usually had only 1 or 2 rooms. Earthen floor, thatched roof, walls made of a mixture of wood, wattle, and daub. The windows were small, perhaps just unglazed holes in the wall, covered with a rag or a wooden board during the day. The interior was dimly lit, and the air was stuffy. Furniture was extremely basic: a trestle table made of rough planks, a few benches or log stools, perhaps a storage platform built of stones in a corner. Sleeping quarters were either straw spread directly on the floor or raised platforms made of wood, also covered with straw and animal hides. The whole family, including children, and sometimes even visiting relatives, squeezed into this cramped space. There was no separate kitchen, no toilet. Personal hygiene conditions were very poor. Garbage and wastewater were usually thrown directly outside, making the village paths muddy and smelly. Animal manure was an important fertilizer and would be collected and piled near the house, waiting to be spread on the fields. Such an environment naturally bred mosquitoes, flies, and diseases. Despite such a harsh life, when the family gathered around a dim oil lamp, usually a small pottery bowl filled with animal fat and a wick, or the flickering hearth fire, sharing a simple but warm evening meal, perhaps they could feel a brief moment of warmth. The children would chatter about interesting things they encountered during the day, and your wife would discuss with you what needed to be done tomorrow. You might also talk about the crops in the field, or some new demand from the Lord. In the smoky haze, the aroma of food, if it could be called an aroma, and the low murmurs of family conversation constituted a rare comfort in this exhausting day. Dinner, that meager meal, hardly deserving of the name cuisine, was quickly polished off. The children licked the last traces of pottage from their fingers, still wanting more, but they also knew that was all the food for the day. You leaned against the rough wall, feeling that tiny bit of fullness in your stomach, and with it, an even heavier wave of fatigue. The flame of the oil lamp flickered gently in the dim hut, casting wavering shadows that made everyone's face appear somewhat indistinct. Your wife began to tidy up the few pottery bowls and wooden spoons, wiping them with a damp rag. You, on the other hand, picked up the sickle dulled from the day's use, or the hoe with a slightly loose handle, and by the faint light, carefully inspected and sharpened it. A whetstone, rubbed back and forth against the iron tool in your hand, made a soft sha-sha sound, one of the few noises in the hut at night. The children, if they were young, would likely be snuggled up to their mother by now, or already curled up on the straw bed, their eyelids heavy. Older children might help you with some chores, like gathering the mended tools into a corner, or listening absently as you talked about things in the fields. There was rarely a dedicated story time, as neither you nor your wife could read, and you seldom had the chance to hear any strange news from afar. What you could narrate were mostly old legends passed down in the village, or some gossip about a neighbor. More often, there was silence. The family silently shared this rare moment of not having to toil in the fields. The air was filled with a mixture of ahino smoke and sweat, a smell you had known since childhood, a part of your life. Night gradually deepened. The barking of dogs in the village also became sparse. You yawned, tears welling up in your eyes. Every cell in your body screamed for rest. You didn't need to look at any clock. Your body's fatigue was the most punctual signal. The family didn't have much of a bedtime ritual. Simply taking off outer clothes, if the weather was hot, many even slept in their daytime clothes. Then everyone found their spot, lay down, and soon drifted off to sleep. You closed your eyes, darkness enveloped you, and in your ears were the sounds of your family's breathing, and occasionally the chirping of insects outside or the su-su sound of wind blowing through the thatched roof. This day, thus, in endless exhaustion, finally came to a close. And for tens of thousands of medieval peasants like you, life cycled on, day after day, year after year. From cock's crow to starlight, most of their waking hours were dedicated to the land and the Lord. So, in such a monotonous, arduous life, lacking personal freedom, how did they find solace? And how did they manage to carry on? Faith, in that era, played a crucial role. The church was not just the geographical center of the village, it was the spiritual center for the vast majority of peasants. Every Sunday, unless it was a particularly busy farming season, peasants would put on their best, or perhaps just their cleanest, clothes and go to church for Massachusetts. This was not just a religious obligation but also a rare social occasion. Here, they could temporarily forget the toil of the fields, listen to the priests recite scriptures in Latin, though most of them couldn't understand it, and feel the solemn atmosphere. The murals and stained glass windows, if the church was relatively wealthy, in the church, depicting biblical stories, were important ways for them to understand doctrine and the world. They believed in God, in the rewards of heaven and the punishments of hell. This faith, to some extent, provided an explanation for their suffering in real life and also brought a glimmer of hope. They prayed for favorable weather, for ample food and clothing, and for protection from illness and disaster. When misfortune struck, they would also find strength in their faith, believing it to be God's test, or they would pray for deceased relatives, hoping they would find peace in heaven. There were also many religious festivals throughout the year, such as Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days. These festivals often involved special religious ceremonies and a few days off from work, providing peasants with rare moments of relaxation and celebration. They might have extra food, like a little meat or white bread, and the village would organize some simple entertainment. Besides the solace of faith, collective life and neighborly mutual aid were also important supports for their survival. A medieval village was a close-knit community. Everyone knew each other very well, and any news would quickly spread throughout the village. Although there were inevitably some neighborly frictions and gossip, mutual aid was more often the norm. For example, if someone in a family fell seriously ill and couldn't work in the fields, neighbors would usually spontaneously offer help, assisting with his strip of land and his family. During planting or harvest season, if a family lacked labor, relatives and friends would also come to lend a hand. This simple spirit of mutual assistance was an important way for them to collectively withstand risks in a harsh environment. Weddings and funerals were important parts of village collective activities. A wedding signified the birth of a new family and was usually accompanied by simple feasting, singing, and dancing. Although the food might still be meager, the joyful atmosphere was enough to make people temporarily forget their troubles. A funeral, on the other hand, united the entire village in grief. Everyone would bid farewell to the deceased and offer solace to the living. As for what we modern people call leisure and entertainment, that was very luxurious and rare for medieval peasants. They had almost no real leisure time. Working from sunrise to sunset was their norm. Even in the less busy winter months, there were many miscellaneous tasks to do, such as repairing tools, weaving household items, and accumulating manure. However, this doesn't mean their lives were completely devoid of any brightness. On long winter nights, families would gather around the hearth, and elders might tell old folk tales, legends of heroes, or their own youthful experiences. This oral tradition enriched their spiritual world. Simple songs and musical instruments, like flutes or small drums, might also appear on certain occasions, bringing moments of joy. Children had their own games, like hide and seek, throwing stones, or imitating adult labor. Though simple, they were full of childish fun. Occasionally, traveling peddlers or entertainers would pass through the village, bringing news from outside and some novelties, which would become topics of eager discussion among the villagers. If there was a market nearby, they would also, with the Lord's permission, take their small surplus of agricultural products or handicrafts to exchange for necessities like salt, iron tools, or a small piece of cloth. Market days were usually quite lively. One could see people from different villages and hear various accents, serving as a small outing. Some villages might also have a humble tavern where men would gather after work, drink a few cups of low-quality ale, boast or complain a bit. This was also a way for them to relieve stress. Looking back at their day, from the rooster's crow at dawn to the silence of deep night, almost every hour was filled with various labors and obligations. They were tightly bound to the land, dependent on the Lord, their living standards low, and their destinies often not their own to control. If viewed through our modern lens, this life was undoubtedly extremely arduous, even, one might say, quite akin to that of a corporate slave, forced to repeat high-intensity labor day after day merely to survive, with almost no respite or choice. The bosses they faced were the Lord and the unpredictable nature, and their KPIs were the life-sustaining rations and the obligatory rents and taxes. Yet, it was in this seemingly hopeless normality that they also displayed astonishing resilience and adaptability. They sought solace in faith, found warmth in community, and through generations of passed-down experience, fumbled for ways to coexist with nature. They were ordinary, small, unknown, like dust on the earth, but it was these tens of thousands of them who formed the foundation of medieval European society and nourished the civilization of that era with their diligent sweat. Their lives may not have had epic grandeur, but they were filled with the most authentic human experiences, full of the tenacity and hope of striving to live on amidst hardship. Well, my friend, that's all for our chat about the medieval peasant's day for now. I wonder if this slow narration has given you a slightly more concrete feeling for that distant history? The night is now very deep. The world outside your window must have quieted down as well. Perhaps you're already feeling a bit sleepy. The labors and daily routines of those distant ages, like a slowly fading dream, gradually recede in our telling. The dust of history will eventually settle. And at this moment you can let go of all your thoughts, allowing your body and mind to relax. Let those furrows, huts, rooster crows, and starlight all dissolve into the most distant and hazy backdrop of your dreams. Good night, sweet dreams.